Good evening and welcome everybody to the late night Chloe of the Midnight Storytellers Story Cabaret. Nothing is practiced, nothing is rehearsed. There's probably nothing in my brain cells at all. This is verbal jazz. And somebody said before we started, is there a dragon tonight? There's a dragon coming to you now. It starts with a young man in the Irish countryside. And he was a poor young man, and he wasn't stupid, but it was one of these young people who couldn't hold on to a job, and he was willing to turn his hand to anything. I mean, he would work on a farm, he'd work in a factory, he'd work in a shop, he'd try anything, but the jobs or businesses failed, or he got on the wrong side of somebody, and he ended up living in the most miserable, scruffy cottage in the middle of the Irish countryside, in the middle of nowhere. And he was so poor that all he could afford to eat was gruel. I'm not sure it's that different from grits, but I mean, porridge. Take porridge. I love porridge on a cold winter's day, right? And you can put sugar in it and cream and milk and fruit and jam. And my mother used to eat porridge with golden syrup and milk and cream all at once, and she lived to 94, so it didn't do her any harm. Gruel is different. Gruel is sloppy. Gruel is ploppy. Gruel honestly looks like you've already eaten it. And this poor young man, he had to eat gruel for breakfast, lunch, and tea. It was a warm summer's morning, warm enough that the flies were out. And he was sitting in this horrible, scruffy kitchen at the kitchen table with a bowl of gruel and a spoon, and he was trying to spoon this stuff that he really hated, but it was all he had to eat. He was trying to spoon gruel into his mouth, and he could not get the spoon from his bowl to his mouth without a fly landing on it. And suddenly he lost his temper. He smacked his hand down. The bowl went that away. The spoon went that away. The gruel went everywhere. There was gruel dripping off the ceiling. There was gruel running down the walls. There was gruel dripping off the end of his nose. Well, after you've had a scream, a shout, an explosion, so you feel better. He calmed right down, and he realized he had to clean up the mess he had made. So he was wiping down the kitchen table, and he realized there were dead flies all across the surface. 7 dead flies. And he looked and he said, that's amazing. I killed 7 with one blow. Maybe I'm wasted trying to do the things that I've been trying to do. Maybe I'm a hero. I can kill 7 with one blow. Right, that does it. I'm not stopping here, wasting my life anymore. I'm going to go out into the world and be a hero and have adventures and make my fortune. So he did what heroes have to do. He packed up his few belongings into the traditional spotted handkerchief, which he tied on the end of a stick. But then he did something that a lot of heroes actually can't do, because a lot of heroes cannot read or write. This young man made himself a sash on which he wrote some words, and I invite you to help me remember those words, especially this evening. The words he wrote were, I killed 7 with one blow. And he put the sash on, and he walked out of the cottage and down the lane and out of the village and away from everybody and everything he'd ever known. He set out across Ireland. And for the rest of that day, he walked until the sun had set. His feet and his knees and his legs were aching, and he came to the edge of a great forest. And he knew from the stories, he knew it is not safe to walk through a great and ancient forest at night. So he made himself a bed of leaves underneath one of the trees there at the side of the track, and he covered himself over with dry leaves, and he went to sleep. And he slept really well. There were, none of the rustlings, the squeakings, the hootings, the snarlings in the distance. Nothing woke him up. He didn't even wake up as the sun came down through the leaves next morning and the birds were singing. He didn't even wake up at the sound of horses' hooves, a lot of horses' hooves, thubbity thud, coming down the track towards him. Who were they? It was a king and his knights in armor, a king on his big white horse. And the knights, well, normally if I say knights in armor, you think shiny, you think heroic, you think smart. Well, not this lot. I mean, they had, battle helms, and there should have been, bright plumes on top of the war helms, but there weren't any. There were just singed stubs, and that armor was biffed and bashed and battered and dented. And to be honest, all those knights on their horses looked as if they'd been in a battle and lost. As the king on his big white horse rode past our hero lying in his bed of leaves, it just so happened that our hero rolled over and that sash came into view. The sash which had the words on it, "I killed 7 with 1 blow." Got it. And it just happened to be a king who could read. Not all of them could in those old days. The king read the words and reined in his horse and said, "Knights, bring us that man." So a couple of the knights jumped down and woke up our hero, got him out of the leaves, dusted him off, and took the slug out of his ear and brought him to the king. The king put on a great big welcoming smile. "Young man, we are delighted to meet you. Clearly, you are a fine heroic something or other. I'm so impressed at meeting you, I can't find the words. But we have a job for you, if you would be willing. It pays really well. I mean, before you even start the work, we will pay you 200 gold coins, a suit of armor, and a new horse. Now, what do you think of that, eh?" And this young man, who you've already realized is no fool, this young man was thinking, this is dodgy, but it's a king, and there are knights with big swords. I'd better make polite. So the young man smiled and nodded and said, "Well, Your Majesty, that sounds amazing. What's the job you'd like me to do?" And the king, still with his great big smile, the king said, "Oh, it's nothing much. And by the way, if you do a good job, you can marry my daughter, the princess, and you can have a castle and all the gold and silver you'll ever want, and I'll make you a baron. And what do you think of them potatoes, eh?" And the young man was thinking, this is really dodgy. In fact, he'd already come up with a plan. His plan was to say yes and take the advance payment, 200 gold coins, a suit of armor, and a new horse. He could live for years on that. And he was going to say yes and then ride off on the new horse over the hills and far away and never be found again. Good plan, yes? Really good, no. I mean, it could have been. It should have been, but it wasn't. The young man said, Your Majesty, I'm loving the sound of everything you are telling me, but what is the job that you would like me to do? And that is when the king's big smile stopped. And the king said, Well, it's like this. You see, we've been having a spot of bother with a dragon. Sorry, Your Majesty, I didn't quite catch that last word. It's a dragon. It's a great big dragon, and it's been eating everything and everybody. It ate the vicar last week. We don't mind that so much, but I mean, it's eating the livestock. It's eating the. I mean, I sent my look. You can see my knights here, all 27 of them. We started out with 34, and look, they're biffed and they're bashed and they're battered and they're dented. They fought the dragon and they lost. So I need a hero. And look, it says on your sash, you killed 7 with 1 blow. You're absolutely the person we need for this job. So the young hero said, Your Majesty, of course I can do this for you. No trouble at all. So the king and the knights escorted the young hero back to the castle, and they helped him put on the new suit of armor, and he was lifted, squeak and clank, onto the horse. And there was the lovely chink-a-chink sound of gold coins being counted, all 200 of them, into the saddlebag. And our young hero gathered up his reins, and he was all ready to gallop over the hills and far away, when the king drew his own great big sword and walked around behind the horse and walloped it on the backside, and the horse bolted across the drawbridge and down the road, and our young hero could not turn it. He couldn't stop it. And what no one had told him, of course, was that the horse was specially trained to gallop straight to the hill where the dragon was living. And the horse was going so fast it couldn't stop until it actually got right to the top of the hill, where, of course, it smelt the dragon and panicked. Nay! And this time the young man couldn't hang on, and thump, splat. Of course, if you fall off a horse, you always fall into a puddle, even if there's been a drought for 16 weeks. He fell in a puddle, and he rolled, and he rolled, and he rolled almost down the side of the hill, except there was a hedge that got a hold of him. And so he was underneath the hedge, getting his breath back, and it was just as well he was underneath the hedge and out of sight, because the next moment, down swooped the dragon and pounced on the horse and ate it in 3 bites, saddle, bridle, everything. And then the dragon sat back on its enormous blue and purple scaly backside and got a hold of the spike end of its tail and started toothpicking the bits, the horse's bit and the stirrup irons out of its teeth. And then the dragon curled up and went to sleep, having had its snack. And this left our hero under the hedge, having to come up with a new plan really quickly. And he was absolutely terrified, but even though he was absolutely terrified, he kept on thinking. And he thought himself up a new plan. The plan was this: to very carefully take off his armor so that he did not squeak or clank, and tiptoe past the dragon and run for his life. Good plan, eh? Yes? Good plan? No. I mean, it could have been. It should have been. But it wasn't. He got out of the armor. He tiptoed past. Well, he was right behind the dragon when it woke up. And at the far end of the dragon, the huge blue and purple scaly head lifted up and started to swing around, and the sooty-edged nostrils flared as the dragon breathed in. Hey, smell pudding. Our young hero ran faster than I can tell you about it. He ran to the very top of the hill where luckily there was a big tall tree, not quite a redwood, but not far off. And faster than I can tell you about it, the young man climbed that tree all the way to the top where he hung on tight, swaying dangerously at the top of the tree. The dragon could see he was up there. The dragon reached up and couldn't get him, and clawed at him with its wing spikes and couldn't reach him, and swung at him with his tail spike and couldn't get to him. Come down! I want to eat you. No, thanks. I'm staying up here. It's it's a good view from up here. Very well. I can wait. And the dragon, vast slithering beast, coiled itself around the base of the tree and went back to sleep. So there was our hero stuck at the top of this tree with a huge, great, ravenous, dangerous, claw him apart and devour him dragon right underneath. He needed a new plan. He was so scared. His heart was pounding. But even though he was really frightened, he kept on thinking. And he came up with a new plan. Here was the plan. There was a branch that stuck out right over the top of the sleeping dragon. And our hero's plan was to climb down, get onto the branch, and get out along the branch right to the far end beyond the dragon, drop down, and run for his life. Good plan, yes? Yeah, it could have been. It should have been. But it wasn't. He got onto the branch. His balance was good, but the further he got out along the branch, the more the branch was bending and bouncing, and the more he was swaying, and literally, as our hero got right over the dragon, crack, and down he dropped, thump, and he landed astride the dragon's neck, right behind its head. Of course, the dragon woke up. It shook itself, but by instinct, the young man hung on for his life. And the dragon started to get furious. You want to ride a dragon? The wings spread out with the sound of 1,000 leather coats. You want to ride a dragon? Very well, I'll give you a ride you'll never forget. And the wings went whoomph, and the dragon took off, flying up into the air, soaring around the hilltop at full speed, with our young hero clinging onto the rapidly heating scales. But the dragon couldn't shake him off. It barrel rolled, it looped the loop, and still our hero hung on. At last, the dragon shot off, flying fast and low across the fields and the hedges of the Irish countryside. Meanwhile, back at the castle, the king was signing the order for a short, cheap funeral for the hero who had failed to come back. And he was just putting his signet ring into the hot wax when the chief of the guards came running into his office. Your Majesty, the dragon's coming, everybody panic, the dragon's coming. Give the king his due. The king did not panic. The king made sure he had his sword. He called out the bowmen, the archers, all of his soldiers and guards, and they all went together with the king up to the battlements. And the king stood with his men along the battlements, looking out across the valley into the sunset sky, a sunset of lurid pinks and oranges and reds. And in the middle of the sunset sky was this little black shape, and that little black shape was getting bigger. It was the dragon, and it was flying straight for the castle. But the thing was, the dragon wasn't looking where it was going. It was, all the dragon was thinking about was this nuisance on its neck, and it was flying as fast as it knew, not looking where it was going, straight at the castle wall, a castle wall that had stood tall and strong for hundreds of years. And there was the dragon coming in hot. Thunk, badoink. The dragon knocked itself out and flopped to the ground. Our hero jumped off and looked up at the king on the battlements and said, "Your Majesty, one dragon as ordered. You better get down here a bit quick." Down came the king. And this does go against the grain for me to tell this part of the story, because obviously, as the world's only living dragon whisperer, I prefer to rescue and rehabilitate dragons, but it is a truth known to all dragon whisperers. You can't save them all. And this dragon had been eating everything and everyone, and was not to be rehabilitated. So the king drew his great big sword and thunk. That was the end of the dragon. In many stories like this, the hero gets cheated of his reward. Not this time. The king kept his word. There was a castle. There was gold and silver by the box and barrelful. There was a wedding. There was a sumptuous wedding, and our hero, with his new baronial tunic and everything splendid, he married the princess. And you would think he lived happily ever after, yes? No, I mean, he could have done, he should have done, but I'll tell you what, it only took 2 or 3 weeks for our hero to realize that the princess, with her temper and her moods and a voracious appetite, was more of a dragon than the real one had ever been. Thank you. Thank you very much. So now I want to tell you a story which I really haven't told for a long time. In the very ancient times of the world, when there was still magic, or when the powers swirled between the realms, on the island of Japan, it is said, there were 800 gods and goddesses and lesser deities. Among the most powerful was the sun goddess, Amaterasu, tiny, golden, exquisite. As a sun goddess, she was devoted to her duty. You've never seen the sun come up late. You've never seen it stop a moment before it's supposed to. She did exactly the right thing every day, every second, every minute. Amaterasu lived in a shining palace high in the mountains of Japan. an exquisite place, a place of shining golden beauty, a kind of palace in the pure Japanese style, where there is a place for everything and everything in its place. In the heart of this perfect palace was the Hall of Weaving. And in the Hall of Weaving were 7 magical looms, and 7 magical maidens sat weaving at those looms. And some people say that what they wove was nothing less than destiny itself. Amaterasu, the sun goddess, had a younger brother, Susanoo Mikoto, and he was completely the opposite. He was chaotic. He was a roisterer. He was a pain. He was the god of oceans and storms and earthquakes and volcanoes and tsunami. And with everything that he did, he irritated his older sister. He loved it. He loved winding her up. He loved where she brought order to each day, he delivered destruction and chaos. And as so often happens with younger brothers and older sisters, they really didn't get on. And she would nag him. Pull yourself together, behave correctly, behave like a young god should. But there came a time when Susanoo Mikoto decided he really had to make an effort. He really did his level best to improve his behavior. And in fact, he did so well that Amaterasu decided to take the risk of inviting her brother to dine. Now, she wasn't daft. She closed the door of the Hall of Weaving. She put her little pet pony into a side room. Well, you know how the Japanese love things in miniature. She had one of these little miniature Shetland type ponies, only of course it was slightly magical. It had a sparkly silver gold mane and a long silver gold sparkly tail. It had these great big brown eyes. It was piebald brown and white. It had a velvety pink soft nose and little shining golden hooves. I have to tell you, this does not end well for the pony. You are warned. But Amaterasu put it into a side room, thinking to keep it safe. She welcomed her brother to the palace. He came up the steps out of the world. He arrived at the palace. He had on his finest robes of sea blues and greys and greens. And they went into an inner chamber, an exquisite Japanese chamber with just the right little flower arrangement in the alcove. And they sat on cushions on the floor, and they had their food and a little bit of warmed sake rice wine, not too much, just enough. And everything was elegant and perfect and delicious. And Susanoo Mikoto even remembered to eat with his mouth closed, which is quite an achievement for men in that part of the world. His language was moderate, his conversation was polite. Amaterasu was delighted. But as soon as the meal was over, she got to her feet. She said, "Brother dear, I have been so pleased to welcome you and so pleased to see the changes in you. But as you know, I have to make an early start in the morning. So I must bid you good night. I see you haven't quite finished your drink. Please, you're most welcome to stay and finish your drink. And I look forward to seeing you another day." And she turned and she swooshed out of the room all shining and golden and tiny and beautiful. And off she went. And the moment that she'd gone, Susanoo Mikoto finished the sake wine he had in front of him and sent the servants scurrying to bring more wine. And some of you know, sake is as strong as whiskey. And it's served a little warm and it goes down easy. And that all went down easy for Susanoo. And then he demanded more and more after that. And it wasn't very long before Susanoo Mikoto could hardly say his own name because he was absolutely plastered. And he was on his feet. And in a palace like that, you got posh paper walls, beautifully painted. He didn't give a tinkers about paper walls. He walked straight through the wall out into the corridor, and the servant screamed and ran. And then Susanoo Mikoto was staggering through the palace corridors and through more paper walls. And there was a little scurry of hooves behind him because he'd gone through the chamber in which the pony had been shut, but he didn't notice at that moment. And then he got into the hall of weaving, and the 7 maidens were snoozing at their looms at that time of night. Well, they didn't stay snoozing for long. Susanoo Mikoto had them all awake, and some of them were not maidens by the time he had finished. I am not entirely sure if they wanted to complain or not, but then when he'd done, he was on his way, and he got out to the palace gate, and he stepped out into the cold night air. And of course, you are all too clean living, aren't you? This has never happened to you, where you've been at a party and you've had a skinful, and you step outside and that cold air rushes down inside you and curdles everything that's in your stomach. Oh, it's an awful moment. I remember it well. It's a terrible moment, and it was happening to Susanoo Mikoto when from behind him came again the pitter-patter clatter of tiny golden hooves, and a little velvety pink nose nudged him. The pet pony wanted a treat. And it picked the wrong moment, and it had picked the wrong person to ask for a treat. In a drunken rage, Susanoo Mikoto turned and seized the pony and shook it until its little hooves jangled, and then he ripped its head off. And he threw the body down there and the head over there, and yes, there was blood all over the place. And then he collapsed into a drunken snoring heap there at the top of the steps that led back down into the world. And he lay there snoring and belching and farting in his sleep all night. And some of us have, yes, we have slept next to one of those. First thing in the morning, out came Amaterasu, golden and tiny and exquisite and ready to do her duty. And as she stepped out, she nearly fell headlong over her brother, still drunken asleep at the top of the steps. And then she saw the dried blood and the body of her pet pony over there, and its head over there. Amaterasu didn't say a word. She just ran. She ran, flying out from the top of her mountain, flying out across the island of Japan, all the way to the top of another great mountain in Japan, where there was the dark opening of a cave. The sun goddess hurled herself inside that cave, and with her magical powers, she took a huge boulder and dropped it down in front of the cave mouth, sealing herself in. And darkness and cold spread across the world. Everything that breathed, everything that grew began to freeze, began to die. The ice sheets were spreading back out across the world. 790 something gods and goddesses and lesser deities of Japan swarmed to the mountaintop. Some of the first few humans came with them, and they banged on the boulder and they begged their sun goddess to come back out. But all they got was her voice. All they heard was, "No, I'm not coming back out. Never again, never, ever. Why should I come back into a world where my own brother can do something so cruel?" And they began to think this was the end, that the world was doomed without her warmth. And then one of the humans, I think it was, who came up with the idea of, well, why don't we persuade her? Why don't we try a little bribery and corruption? And so they started to offer her gifts. I mean, normally I ask the audience, but it's difficult to ask you. But I mean, people say things like, well, offer her jewels. And her reply was, "I've got all the jewels I could ever want in the mountains around me. I don't need jewels." And flowers. I don't need flowers. How about a pet? I had a pet and it's dead. He killed it. And they offered her handbags and dresses and shoes by extraordinary shoemakers who hadn't even been invented yet. And she didn't want any of it. And they really began to think they were doomed. When another little goddess turned up. I don't know what she'd been doing. Quite possibly this little goddess had been getting over a hangover of her own, because this goddess was Uzume. And Uzume was the goddess of mirth. Uzume was the goddess of having a good time. She'd probably been partying. And so she was late to come to all this fuss at the top of the mountain. And honestly, she was built a bit like me. You know, she was short and rather wide for her height. And she puffed and she panted and she sweated her way to the top of the mountain. She saw everybody there. She said, "What is going on? It's freezing out there. What have you done?" And the deities and gods and goddesses and everybody explained to Uzume what had happened. And Uzume said, "You numpties, you made a right mess of this, haven't you? Ugh, right, you lot, naff off down the mountain and I'll sort this out by myself." So the 790 something gods and goddesses and lesser deities and the humans naffed off down the mountain and left Uzume to get to work. First of all, she fetched a magical 8-sided mirror and hung it up in the branches of a tree just around to the side of the cave mouth. And then Uzume went down the mountain and put on her most beautiful robes, her brightest silks, and all her makeup. And then she got one of those gigantic Japanese drums and dropped it on its side, jumped onto it, and started to dance with her little feet, pounding a rhythm. And she shimmied, and she leapt, and she spun, and she twirled. And this was a big girl. There was a lot of her to twirl, and a lot of her was bouncing. In fact, she gave it so much welly that bits of her were bouncing right out of her robes, and the audience loved it and cheered and roared and yelled for more. They were seeing parts of a goddess they didn't even know a goddess had, and how they applauded. And the sound of that cheering and applause floated up the mountain and squeezed in around the edge of the boulder into the darkness of the cave where Amaterasu sat in her goddess-sized sulk. She heard the noise. What's going on? Who's getting all the applause? I am the sun goddess. That applause should be for me. What's happening out there? And her curiosity would not let her go. And so with a little push of her magical powers, she nudged the boulder halfway aside and looked out. And the moment that her light shone out of the cave, the magical eight-sided mirror caught that light and made it spin and made it dance and made it swirl in rainbow colors around her. And Amaterasu was captivated. She was entranced. She could not resist. With one last push of magical power, she flung the boulder out of the way and stepped out of the cave and turned and saw her reflection in the mirror. In all her existence, Amaterasu had never had time to stop to consider herself. In all her existence, in all her seen to duty, Amaterasu had never been told, no one had even thought to tell her, how truly gorgeous and exquisite she was. But now, when she looked in the mirror, she saw that she was truly beautiful. And Amaterasu felt better. She felt much better about herself and everything. So she walked back down the mountain. And this is what clever little Uzume had been waiting for. She'd been waiting for the the sun goddess to appear. And at just that moment, Uzume got off the stage. And the sun goddess walked back into that space, walked out in front of all the gods and goddesses and lesser deities and the desperate, grateful humans who welcomed her with tears of joy, with open arms, with laughter and applause. So Amaterasu was welcomed back to her place in the world. And Susanoo Mikoto was banished to the deepest, darkest abyss of the ocean, but we all know he doesn't stay there. He still causes trouble. You know perfectly well he causes earthquakes and tsunami to this very day. But the humans learnt something. They learnt that when it's cold and miserable and hopeless, you don't give up. You don't go off into a cave and sulk. You don't just despair. You gather your friends any way you can. You gather them in the real world. You gather them in the other realm. You gather your friends around you, and you have yourselves a bloody good time together. Thank you very much. And that concludes the story Cabaret for tonight.